So let's talk about strategies of tension to get people to fight each other in order to establish some sort of a government political agenda, either to boost up nationalism, either to establish a police state or a militarist state. These are really the goals of the strategy of tension, getting different political factions to fight each other in order to establish a particular agenda or political objective. This sort of thing took place in the Balkans, and this eventually led to the Balkan Wars of the 1990s. It really goes to show you how these strategies of tension can escalate into very, very bloody conflicts between different ethnic groups who historically hate each other. I remember years ago in Dallas, there were several cops that were murdered. They were murdered by an Afrocentric fanatic racist, someone who subscribed to the religion of Hemitism. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it's basically the black equivalent of the white neo-pagans who want to establish a white ethno-state. They wear the Thor's hammer necklaces, and they have neo-pagan tattoos on their bodies. The Hemet cultists, they believe in this sort of modern day African voodoo religion. You know, it's like, oh, let's bring back the old African gods, let's bring back voodooism, and let's use it as a way to empower the black man against white supremacy, that sort of thing. So this guy, this pagan, he murdered numerous cops in Dallas. And I remember after that happened, the next day I got a message from a friend of mine in Serbia. His name was Lazar. And Lazar told me, what happened in your country, what is happening in your country, it's exactly what I saw happening in Balkans before the wars that happened in 1990s. And him and I had a nice conversation about this through video chat, and I remember he was telling me about how what he was seeing taking place in the United States reminded him of what was happening in the Balkans, which eventually escalated into the Balkan conflicts of the 1990s. And he said that it began with the killing of police officers. Today I was doing some research on this, and I found out some interesting things. After the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, in which the Slavs, in particular the Serbs, defeated the Ottomans, and then after that actually allied with the Ottomans to defeat the Bulgarians. Essentially, after the Ottomans were defeated in the Balkans, the Serbs began to persecute and brutalize the ethnic Albanians. Now, of course, if you look deeper into this, you'll find out that that goes back to some violence between the two, and you have the whole, well, he killed me and he destroyed my village thing taking place. And you always find these things in conflicts, always. It's, he did this to me, well, he did this to me, and he killed my great-great-great-grandfather, and he burned a church down, and he destroyed my village, and it never ends. The cycle of violence never ends. And so within this vicious cycle, there is this continuation of hatred and violence that is ceaseless. It really is ceaseless. And it will continue on for centuries. And after during the Second World War, the Germans invaded Yugoslavia, and they began to arm certain factions. They began to arm the people who really hated the Serbs, essentially. They armed the Albanians. They made an SS unit that consisted of Albanians, the Skanderberg division, I think it was called. They also armed the Bosnians, and they made an SS unit for them, and they also made an SS unit for the Croatian fascists. And the Croatian fascists were probably the most vicious of them all. They ended up murdering about 1 million people, Serbs, Jews, Gypsies, etc. So there was a huge amount of anger, and the Bosnians, they began to slaughter the Serbs as well. But the Bosnians, they would say, well, the Serbs did this to our people back in the day and all that stuff, and the Croats would say the same thing. And again, the vicious cycle never ends. But the Germans, they had this very strong interest in fragmenting Yugoslavia during the Second World War. When Hitler invaded Yugoslavia, they broke Yugoslavia down, they fragmented it, and they began to support certain political factions, pretty much anyone who was against the Serbs, because the Serbs were a strong ally to the Soviet Union. After the Second World War, this hatred continued on. And there was a guy by the name of Enver Hoxha. And Enver Hoxha was the leader of Albania. He was ruling this regime in Albania, and he began to send weapons and paramilitaries, armed groups, into Yugoslavia with the goal of destabilizing that southern Slavic bloc that we called Yugoslavia. And the Albanians who were living within Yugoslavia, because Yugoslavia had, numerous different ethnic groups, they began to protest against the Serbs. One of the things that the Albanians protested was police brutality. And what this ended up doing was escalating the tensions to the point that police brutality actually increased. It accelerated the situation to where police brutality got worse. It intensified, it exasperated the situation. Albanians began to target cops. And this was happening in the late 1940s when Albanians protesting against the Serbs, that began in the late 1940s, but it continued on. Now, fast forward to the 1990s, you have NATO, in particular Germany, backing the fascist Albanian paramilitary group called the KLA. In fact, the KLA was really a creation of NATO. It was armed and trained to a great extent by Germany, a major NATO country. In fact, Germany was on board with the whole bombing of Kosovo idea before the United States. Germany was pushing the Clinton administration to bomb Kosovo. Germany was also very, very enthusiastic about arming political factions against the Serbs in the hopes of fragmenting Yugoslavia. The same goal that Hitler had, the Germans had in the 1990s. So Nazi Germany wanted to fragment Yugoslavia during the Second World War, and West Germany in the 1990s wanted to fragment Yugoslavia. The goal never ended because really, ultimately, fascism has always been here. Fascism has never ended. It's still here. It has masqueraded itself. It has masqueraded itself under, different, jargon like, oh, let's bring stability to the region and all these things. Or they'll say, it's about nationalism. It's about self-determination. It's about freedom. These terms are used to masquerade actual fascistic objectives. In the context of the Balkans, it was Germany supporting the KLA, which consisted of, and these weren't, the KLA guys, these weren't exactly puritanical Muslims. These were people who were drug dealers, these were criminals, these were some very evil people. These were also people who boasted about how their grandparents were fascists, who cooperated with the Nazis, who were in the SS. These were truly Albanian racist and fascist. These were also criminals. These people were backed by the Germans to do basically the same thing that Hitler wanted, which goes to show you Fascism never died. The spirit of fascism is still very strong in NATO countries. That's why you have Japanese nationalists in very, very prominent positions of government in Japan, like people like Shinzo Abe, who deny that the Nanking massacre happened. That's why NATO supported the Ukrainian fascists in 2014. That's why the United States is backing Saudi Arabia in its war against Yemen. That's why the United States backed Saudi Arabia in its genocide in Yemen, in which Saudi Arabia butchered tens of thousands of people with starvation and bombs. It was really, really horrific. And that war, I think, the war between Saudi Arabia and Yemen has kind of been put on pause because of coronavirus. But before COVID, it was pretty horrific. But the spirit of fascism is still very strong in NATO. And the Germans were backing fascists in the 1990s to continue on the same objectives, to complete the same objective of the Third Reich. And so the Germans, they were training the KLA, they were arming the KLA. The Americans also were doing the same thing. The KLA began to target Serbs. Police officers were targeted by Albanian nationalists. And eventually it escalated into a war. So this was a perfect example of a strategy of tension. Perfect example, just perfect. And you see it right there. And that's what Lazar was telling me in our conversation. He was telling me about these things. And he was telling me about how the targeting of police officers, this emphasis on fighting police brutality, it really is a pretext for another agenda, which is to cause chaos. This is why when you see these anti-police protests, you'll see people with the Joker masks. Why do you think they do that? It's because they believe in anarchy. And these people will bring chaos. And they say that they are against police brutality. But let's go back to what happened with the Albanians. The Albanians were protesting police brutality. And it ended up being that what they were doing in escalating the tensions, in causing violence, in targeting police officers, was actually making it worse. In bringing chaos, you actually force in this system, this apparatus of quote-unquote order. Because when you usher in chaos, there has to be another force that's going to bring in the balance. That force is not going to be something that you want. It reminds me of Jordan Peterson. Peterson always talks about, balance and order. You have chaos. You have chaos, but then you have order. Well, you need a little bit of chaos because, you need a wild side. But then if you just have chaos, well, it's just all crazy and there's a lot of instability there, and that's not good. He has that Canadian dialect. That's not good. But when you have chaos, there has to be a force to come in. It's inevitable. There's going to be a force that's going to come in to bring in order. And that order is going to be violent. It's going to be oppressive. It's going to be terrible. People think that, because I will say I support the police, people think that when I say things like, hey, these protests are for another agenda, they think that I'm a bootlicker or that I worship the police or something like that, or that I am in favor for police brutality. What I'm trying to say is that what you guys are doing is actually going to accelerate the situation to the point where you're going to have even worse police brutality. We have cases of police brutality, but things would be much worse if there was a societal chaos and if there was a very strong prospect of societal breakdown. Because the government is going to want to keep order and they're going to enforce the situation with violence. And that's what makes this thing so scary. So I'm actually against the idea of a police state. And I'm trying to prevent the creation of a police state by telling people, by warning people, that if you encourage chaos, you are going to have a very violent system of order. And that's what you don't want. You could also encourage the other side. You can encourage right-wing paramilitaries, because right-wing paramilitaries are going to look at the situation and say, hey, We need to establish order. This is our chance to shine. They're going to say, oh, we have to take the law into our own hands because the government is too weak. And then they're going to commit atrocities and kill people and murder people. It's horrific. It really is horrific. So it's the reality of the situation. That is the reality of the situation. If you push for chaos, you are going to invite a violent system of order. That's the bottom line. And the thing is that the white supremacist and the black supremacist, they both want the same thing. They want to see America balkanize, which means they want America to be like the Balkans. What happened in the Balkans? Bloody, evil war. So the people who are claiming that they're against police brutality, that they're against state violence and all these things, they're actually ushering in what they claim to be against. And that is the great paradox of political activism. People who say that, oh, we're against the idea of a police state, they're actually going to bring in a police state. People who say, I'm an anarchist, I'm against government, they actually will bring in a government that is way more tyrannical than anything that they are currently protesting against. So that is the great paradox of politics. Anyway, hope you guys have enjoyed this message. Hope you guys have learned something from this message. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.